The Automated Podcast.
So welcome back to Automated. My name again is Mark Verbenkov, and we can jump right into things. So last week, we set up the context of the discussion surrounding job automation and saw that there are two main perspectives that can be taken. First one being that jobs will mostly be automated by new and emerging technologies that can do both the physical as well as the cognitive tasks better than human workers. Whereas the second is where automation, as well as these new and emerging technologies, create new sectors and industries, as well as generate new jobs, which actually need human workers. So this week, we will be looking into the latter perspective, which can be broken down into two parts: previous transitions and their impacts, as well as the augmentation potential of technologies. So as the main premise of this side of the discussion mainly draws from historical examples, perhaps the most visual example that can be used is the shift from the horse and buggy to the automobile during the early part of the last century. So it's actually quite an important example, as we are really at the forefront of having autonomous vehicles permeate both our society as well as our roads. Even Elon Musk was quoted recently as saying that by next year, in 2020, Tesla will have over 1 million cars with full level 5 autonomy. So for those of you that don't know, the autonomous vehicles are rated on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 being the kind of highest potential that can be reached, where the human isn't really required to be paying attention to the road or the vehicle at all. The vehicle should be able to do everything that's needed completely by itself. So whether this is true or just a kind of premature prediction, we know that many other companies are also working towards the same future goal. So it will most probably happen at some point in the future. Whether it's 2020 or not, we don't really know yet. But as another episode will look at autonomous vehicles exclusively, let's turn back to horses versus cars. So though it depends on the location selected, between roughly 1910 and 1920, the horse and buggy and horses in general were not used as a main mode of transportation in modern cities anymore. And it was by roughly 1950 that the same occurred for most farms. So for the sake of argument, let's look at just one example, New York City, where in 1900, there were about 100,000 horses employed in the city's transportation. So this actually took the form of many different things. One was private coaches, smaller, quote-unquote taxi-like cabs made for short distances, very similar to our modern taxi. Something called omnibuses, where up to about a dozen horses were pulling a larger carriage filled with people. And of course, the various carts hauling goods, mail, and packages, and of course the waste from all the horses, which in New York City, with its 100,000 horses, came out to about 2.5 million pounds or 1.1 million kilos of manure every single day. So as someone who had part of their childhood on a small hobby farm with actually a few horses, as well as 2 rambunctious siblings who I would constantly get into trouble with, we usually had one very specific punishment. So I can speak from experience when I say that it takes a lot of physical effort to clean up that many 4-legged taxis. But apart from the cleanup army that was necessary in New York City and other major cities in the early 1900s, buggies and harnesses had to be made by the thousands. Vast amounts of land had to be dedicated and tended to, as a typical horse consumed about 5 acres of hay and grain annually. That's per every single horse. So additionally, road maintenance was actually really needed, as wooden slabs were actually used as roads rather than cobblestone, and this was also before asphalt roads were implemented. And the reason that wooden roads were used was that they dampened the apparent deafening sounds of all the hooves throughout the entire city. But this also needed to be replaced roughly every 3 years before asphalt was fully used across the city in 1938. So my goal here is to give a picture of the scope of how much peripheral work was also needed to make the transportation system of the 1900s work. And this is especially important to note, as the adoption of the car brought massive impacts to these sectors as well, apart from the obvious impact on the horse and buggy industry. So in around 1890, there were some 13,000 companies or so in the United States that were building horse carriages. However, by 1920, a mere 30 years away, there were only 90 companies left. So of course, the horse population had a significant drop in its numbers. And due to this, there was actually a large drop in the demand for horse feed. And this contributed to an agricultural depression in the 1920s that is actually masked by the Great Depression that happened in the 1930s. So it was actually in 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, that the Bureau of the Census concluded that the transition from horses to cars was actually one of the main contributing factors to the depression of the time, and had actually affected the entire country. However, on the other side of things, the new auto industry created several new companies as well as many jobs. There's a report that came out through the McKinsey Global Institute that states that between 1910 and 1950, the auto industry created about 6.9 million jobs. This is net in the United States specifically. This was equivalent to about 11% of the country's workforce in 1950, which is pretty significant. And this also includes the 7.5 million jobs that were created, but also the roughly 500,000 jobs that were destroyed. So these jobs actually represented new occupations that serviced cars, as well as utilizing cars for the transportation and delivery of goods and people. So apart from the new occupations that surrounded both using as well as servicing the new automotives, a number of new industries and connected jobs sprung up as well. And one of these is actually the consumer credit system. By 1924, about 75% of cars were paid for over time and actually represented over half of the country's retail installment credit, as people needed to borrow money in order to pay for the cars. As there were no automation systems or computers back then, this was people assessing as well as issuing the credit to the people that actually wanted to buy the cars, as well as all the marketing and other things that were surrounded in order to have people understand that this was something that could be done, as it was relatively new for them to do. So at the time, I don't think that there were very many people that were connecting this new invention that they were seeing on the streets to the creation of new jobs in this new part of the financial sector. So overall, this shift from horses to cars was actually a 50-year period of change. So these are a few of the examples of the changes that happened, and they should give a good representation as well of what this main perspective encompasses, right? Namely that the implementation and adoption of new technologies can eliminate entire industries and professions, while also creating entirely new ones that can employ even more people than beforehand. For if we look back only a few decades ago, several professions didn't even exist. A couple good examples can be the online community manager, digital marketing expert, SEO specialist, app developer, web analyst, data scientist, AI engineer, virtual assistant, the list goes on and on. So this macro level idea can also be applied to more micro level situations if we fast forward to modern times. So computers were actually seen as perhaps the main technology that would automate human workers a few decades ago. Yet today you'd be hard-pressed to really find a job without some form of computer use. So therefore, rather than automating us, we can see that computers, as well as a number of other technologies, have actually been augmenting our abilities by doing some of the tasks that were previously entirely done by human workers and enabling other forms of work to be focused on, which enables a business to grow, which then also enables more people to be hired in that business. So a great but really short example of this is the bank teller versus the ATM. So several years back, ATMs were actually seen as the main technology that would eliminate the need for bank tellers. Yet, when they were finally adopted and used, banks were able to reduce their costs, and by doing so, were actually able to open more branches as the costs for opening a branch were substantially reduced. And in doing so, the number of tellers were actually increased. So from 1970 to 2010, bank tellers actually doubled. So again, to come back to the main idea, if one's to take the position as outlined at the beginning of this episode, then the same can also be said for autonomous vehicles, robots, artificial intelligence, and other technologies, right? Through their use and implementation, the number of jobs will actually increase, and the number of new industries and new sectors will actually increase as well. So this should now give you, hopefully, a good impression of the second point of view when looking at job automation. However, another aspect that's actually really important in these shifts is the speed at which these changes happened and how long people had to change trades. So I specifically like the horse and buggy example, as it was a clear 50-year transition. And the labor absorption rate enabled the transition to go smoothly enough, with companies and workers able to shift industries as well as learn new skills and change the company structures as required. So actually many of the horse carriage manufacturers actually became automotive manufacturers by switching both the parts and processes that were used before, and actually keeping many of the same employees and just reskilling them for this new market that they were selling to. However, one of today's very real worries is that with the exponential speed of technological growth, this needed reskilling in order to stay relevant in the job market won't be able to happen quickly enough, and many people will most probably get left behind through no fault of their own. So now that we've looked at both of the sides of this discussion, namely that either technology will eliminate the need for humans to work, or that technology will continue to generate new industries and constantly create new jobs, the final thought that anyone should be left with is, will the future of automation play out like it has in the past? Will the new emerging technologies allow partial automation and an increase in jobs, or will things be really different this time? Specifically though, will the speed of technology be too great for our society as well as our economy to adapt to? This is one of the main reasons that I feel that this podcast is important, as well as why it exists in order to explore this phenomenon. So the goal of these first two episodes now has been to set the context for how to look at emerging technologies that are either being adapted or will be by our society. So over the next several episodes, we'll actually look at specific technologies and how they fit into this narrative. So that's it for today. If you've liked the podcast so far, please head over to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, and rate it, as well as leave a review if you feel so inclined. Thanks for listening.
The Automated Podcast.